Welcome everybody to Elders Climate Action monthly national call. I'd like to welcome you tonight. We have some great information to share with you and two fantastic speakers who will give you information that will open your eyes to new ways that you can support climate change and environmentally and socially responsible corporations. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We have two presentations tonight. We'll have Q&A at the end of the second presentation. If you have questions, please hover over the bottom of your screen. If you don't know already, you will see a Q&A box. Just type your questions in there. If you want to provide some information or let people know who you are, etc., say hello, you can do that in the chat box. So both of those little icons are at the bottom of the screen. And I'm about to introduce to you one of our co-chairs from our Education Committee. And the Education Committee has worked very hard to provide great national calls and webinars for everybody, and we hope you're going to enjoy them. And tonight, Mark Cook, who is co-chair of the Education Committee, will introduce our two great speakers. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, I want to say thanks to our presenters, Ellonda and Chris, for their generosity. I knocked on their digital doors and they warmly answered when they had every right to be too busy. Ellonda just had a wedding and Chris just released a new book earlier this month. It is an interesting and illuminating story about this crucial movement. Today's presentation by Drs. Chris Marquis and Ellonda Williams will be about the B Corp movement. B Lab, where Dr. Williams works, is the organization that certifies B corporations. Chris is the Samuel C. Johnson Professor in Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell University. Chris is the author of the just released book, Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. Ellonda is the Director of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at B Lab, working to create an equitable, diverse, and inclusive culture for all employees. B Corps are distinct in part because, number one, of a declaration of interdependence, two, a rigorous assessment of their impact on workers, customers, community, and environment, and three, require their boards of directors to balance profit and purpose. Shareholders do not have primacy and are but one of B Corp's stakeholders. Chris will open about the B Corp movement from a bigger picture perspective, and Ellonda will follow with a focus on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, referred to as JEDI. In B Lab's statement on anti-racism, written by Dr. Williams and B Lab's JEDI team, it is stated that capitalism and racism can be seen as co-joined twins, quoting author, historian, and professor Ibram Kendi. The same could be said of modern economies and the environment. Our construct of capitalism is a forced marriage and an extraordinarily abusive relationship between the economy as abuser and environment as the abused. B Corps have a much better potential to produce a better, healthier relationship between the environment and the economy that is more compatible and less in conflict. They are what reimagining our future looks like, but we as citizens, consumers, and investors must actionably support them. Voting with our dollars applies to our spending and investing actions. B Corps are alternatives to consider, and we want you to know more about them. I hope you're as excited as I am about our esteemed and gracious presenters. Chris, please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for the very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here and really happy to be talking about my new book. You know, as Mark mentioned, I have this book that just came out. Here's the cover of it, actually less than 10 days ago. So it's sort of hot off the presses, some new information that you're going to get. You know, the thesis of the book is very much in line with what Mark was just saying, that, you know, the capitalist system we have, you know, needs to change for many reasons. One is to sort of save and protect our environment. And, the argument that I put forth in the book is that, the B Corp movement is really sort of influential to this change because it really shows how companies can move from a shareholder-focused system to a stakeholder-focused system in an effective and accountable way. So I'm going to go through some of that on the book. Great. So, the context today is, much more complicated than when I started writing the book. We have obviously the COVID situation. We have, many instances of, sort of systemic racism that have brought sort of much public attention to that issue. Before the pandemic and this increased attention on systemic racism, there's actually was increasing movement towards a more stakeholder-oriented system. The Business Roundtable, which you might be familiar with, came out in about a year ago, saying the company should switch from a profit-focused, shareholder-oriented system to much more of a stakeholder-oriented system, looking at employees, customers, communities, environment, et cetera. As we come out of COVID, we hope that there will still be some attention for this. I think that there certainly will be. I think a lot of the issues have been highlighted, sort of place even more attention on the need to be stakeholder driven. But deep within our economic system is this sort of shareholder primacy focus, which, as you may know, stems from an article 50 years ago, almost to the day, September 13th, 1970, where Milton Friedman put forth the case in the New York Times Magazine that the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. If you read this thing, it's really actually sort of insulting to our current, sort of day. Argues that any sort of diversity program, environment program is just the absolute wrong thing for companies to be focused on, because they should be focused on profit. And if the managers and shareholders want to spend something on social responsibility, they can actually do that. But it's not something for companies to do. Whether maybe some people might agree with him that businesses should be really economically focused, where I think the real error of this model comes in is that it creates a lot of, I'll call them unintended consequences, to be sort of little charitable. But when executives and CEOs are starting to be paid, based on stock price and stock options, they're so tied to the short-term gain of the companies that actually all of the other costs of the companies get sort of pushed on, sort of, contributions to community, contributions to the environment. And so, the argument that I make in the book, which is not, sort of my novel argument, is basically that this idea of shareholder primacy has really led to some of the biggest social problems of our day. You talk about things like, inequality. Just one indication of that is CEO pay. If you look at the top 1% of the earners and wealthy in the United States, there's a high percentage of senior executives. And they got there through stock options and this unequal pay that has actually occurred since the 1970s. You can see, a little before 1970, the average CEO to worker compensation ratio was about 20. Sort of fast forward, and it's, 300, 400 times. And so, this is, I think, an indication of how, the switch to shareholder option, CEO option pay, and aligning the CEO specifically on the stock price ends up creating, sort of underlying problems in our society. Another is these environmental externalities. So these graphs here are from a study-based company called TrueCost did, that looked at how much of the revenue of certain sectors is actually taken up by environmental externalities. So these are harms to the environment that have economic costs associated with them, sort of healthcare costs from increased pollution, other, costs from pollution. And if you look, many industries, and this is the percentage of the revenue. So, 50, 60% of the actual revenue of entire industries, if you actually factored in the externalities of environment, it would be basically taken up. So, this is, we're increasingly, polluting, other sort of social externalities like healthcare are increasingly, being put on the wayside as companies really focus on the, oh, excuse me, I sort of lost control here. Okay, great. So like I mentioned, there is sort of interest in potentially changing this in this business roundtable, group of the 200, most powerful CEOs in the country from many of the, companies and brands we know of said, the purpose of the corporation really should not be about just short-term profit. It should be about creating a stakeholder model that recognizes employees, communities, and the environment. This sort of sounds very good, and I really applaud the CEOs for sort of taking this action, but it's really hard to do. It's not actually easy to all of a sudden, change to a stakeholder model. I mean, certainly you can give better benefits and give some philanthropy in communities, but to really fundamentally do this is very difficult. And this is where I think that the B Corp model is so important. So yeah, you can see here sort of focusing just stakeholders to much more of a, our shareholder stakeholder movement. So the B Corp movement, as Mark discussed a little bit in his opening comments, has two real fundamental axes in some ways. So one is a governance axis. So, actually B Lab and the B Corp movement has changed laws in over 36 US jurisdictions, in Italy, in Ecuador, in Colombia, and British Columbia, to create a new type of company so that in this type of company, there's not the principle of fiduciary responsibility to shareholders only, but actually stakeholders. All stakeholders have actually equal footing. So the employees, consumers are on the same level as the shareholders. The other axis, impact assessment, is about actually companies going through a very rigorous assessment of their social, environmental, and other operations to really, sort of tell if they're the real deal or, they're just greenwashing. I have some examples here of B corporations. You can see many of the companies you may know of, Patagonia, Athleta, Ben & Jerry's, King Arthur Flour. King Arthur Flour is sort of one of my favorite ones, a company that dates back to 1790, joining with the sort of real interesting progressive companies. Roshan on the right-hand side there is actually the largest telecommunication provider in Afghanistan, all over the world. So the B Corp movement spans 70 plus countries, 150 plus industries, leading companies across the world. So this certification, this very rigorous certification, you have to get actually 80 out of 200 across these different levels. When I was in school and, I'm a professor, 80 out of 140% sounds like it's actually not that good, but actually, having interviewed now close to 100 B Corps, it's really tough. It's really tough to actually, achieve that. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate and have researched this a lot is that I have a lot of respect for how, the level of rigor that the founders of this movement and B Corporation or B Lab team has kept to the standards. The standards change every few years. They're updated to make them more relevant. So this impact measurement idea though, so there's only actually about 3,500 B Corps, which I think because of how rigorous the assessment is, I mean, the number will never be sort of a huge number, but the tools and processes that the B Corp movement has established, so this impact assessment, is widespreadly used. There's over 100,000 users of the BIA, this B impact assessment, and many sort of banks, venture capital funds use the assessment as a way to help understand and gauge the companies that they're going to invest in or lend monies to. So it's a very sort of useful set of tools. Speaking of venture capital investors, in the last couple of years, over $2 billion has been sort of given been invested in B Corps. Many times people say, okay, these social and environmental companies, they must be sort of cutting back on the bottom line. Well, at least as far as the venture capitalists say, these are good investments, and all the major venture capital companies from, Kleiner Perkins, Andreessen Horowitz, New Enterprise Associates, TPG, all have B Corps in their portfolio. So these are companies that are both doing well and doing good. Like I mentioned, it's a global movement. So this benefit corporation statute. So these are the laws that play sort of a new corporate type, the benefit corporation that places share all stakeholders on equal footing. 36 U.S. states plus Puerto Rico and Washington D.C. and then a number of the countries that are listed there or regions as far as British Columbia, and then legislation in process in a number of different places as well. So what does it mean to be a B Corp, you might wonder? So more specifically, companies have to have a concrete purpose. So they have to sort of state, what the purpose of beyond just the, making money for shareholders is, could be for the community, employees. One of the things that is really important is that there's an accountability and transparency dimensions. So you can't just say, I'm going to do my best for my community. Actually, you have to report on it every year or every other year with a standard like the B Corporation assessment, and report on that to the various stakeholders you have. So I think that's sort of Louis Brandeis, the former Supreme Court justice, always said sunshine is the best disinfectant. And I think that opening up the books in some ways on these things is the best way to keep companies accountable. One of the reasons why many people are so enthusiastic about the model is founders. They found their company, they put their life and soul into it. It's sort of part of them and something that they believe in, and they want actually, after maybe they pass on to sort of new adventures, to actually have this social impact still be deeply deeply in the company. And so you have Jan Chenard here from Patagonia. After benefit corporation law passed in California, he said, this will allow mission-driven companies like Patagonia to stay mission-driven by institutionalizing the values, cultures, processes, et cetera, put in place by founding entrepreneurs. So this is in some ways to lock in the social mission of a company, so that maybe investors or other people can come along and sort of hijack things. Many major brands of subsidiaries of large companies. Danone is an amazing participant in this movement. This is something I found on the web. It only has 11 B Corps listed. Actually, there's 20 B Corps that Danone is certified. Danone, $30 billion business based out of France. Over 20 of their subsidiaries, over a third of their revenue are B Corps. They themselves have committed by 2025, the global organization, to become a B Corp. If any of you look in your refrigerator, if you have any, Dannon yogurt, Oikos yogurt, Silk soy milk, Horizon organic milk, you'll find a B Corp logo on those products. It's the Dannon North America operation, $6 billion operation, is a certified B Corp. Unilever, has 7th generation. Ben & Jerry's, two great examples. And then everything from wine to brewery. Overdrive, I don't know if you sort of listen to or read books from your library, but you probably use the service Overdrive. I use the New York Public Library. Overdrive is the provider. Athleta, a really popular yoga and athletic apparel brand. So lots of great brands are B Corps. One of the things that's been announced very recently is a set of work to take the B Corp ideas and movement to larger companies. So, I've been studying the B Corp movement since, 2009, 2010. I wrote the first Harvard Business School case study on B Lab in 2010. And for most of the time, it was smaller to medium-sized companies. So, you see companies like Patagonia. I mean, those are sort of the largest companies that were for very long involved in the B Corp movement. Big companies, probably billion plus sales, but, in the overall scheme of things, where you have these global multinationals like Danone and others, tens of billions, 100 billions, not that big. So, because of the assessment is so rigorous, it's sort of hard if you think about a multinational company that has, operations in 30 plus countries, many different legal entities, how to certify. So this new program, which just I think was announced in the last week or so, is a way to get large companies involved. And you can see sort of the companies above the top, 6 large multinational companies, Danone and Natura. Natura is a cosmetics company based out of Brazil, owns The Body Shop, owns Avon. I think it's about a $10 billion company. And the ones on the left are, everything from vegetable producers to steel producers, fragrance producers, retail businesses are joining. And you can see $30 billion combined revenue. So this is something where this movement is really taking on large companies, which I think when you think about this movement scaling, I think that this is, we'll take it to sort of the next level. Okay, like I mentioned, the global movement, here are some of the countries, here are some of the global, B Corps, you can sort of see them. So some of them you maybe know, some of you don't, all really interesting and important companies. Another sort of aspect of the B Corp movement I think is really important is that they've integrated the B impact assessment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This week the UN is in session, lots of attention on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think are really important for us as societies to have common goals to focus on. I think these goals are not, though, necessarily operationalized well for business. And so this partnership between B Lab and the UN Global Compact to create a way for business to operationalize these goals, I think is a real important contribution to having them succeed. And then so my final points, and Mark actually sort of started us off with this as well, is that, if we're going to be, each of ourselves buying things in our daily life, as conscious consumers, we have a chance to actually make a change. And so I think, I just want to close the talk with, as you're buying your products, think about the environment, think about the, society, and choose companies that are doing well in your local environments, in national environments. And I think the key thing is that, many times you don't know actually what companies are doing. Maybe they're just greenwashing, sort of saying that they're doing well in the environment, doing well in society, but actually, maybe they're not. But, with the B Corp logo, you can be certain that these are companies that are authentically, have a purpose behind them, and that you can count on actually, that if you spend money on them, that'll be going to a good cause as well. So with that, I'm going to stop. My book, you can sort of see it there. It's on sale at all major retailers. I'm very excited. Long process of researching it. So sort of very happy and proud to have it out, and really happy and excited to talk to all of you about it. So thank you very much, Mark, and everyone for listening. So I think we're going to send it over to Ellonda now. Is that right, Mark? Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So Christopher, I'm going to share my screen. So if you can stop sharing, I think then I can jump in. Perfect. Oh, this is such a great experience, right? I get to hear other folks talk about B Corps. And I work at B Lab, and B Lab certifies B Corp. So it's really cool to hear someone as passionate as Christopher really talk about B Corps, what they do, and is the perfect segue. So Christopher set us up really nicely to think about how is climate change, specifically to think about how the structure of B Corps, what B Corps are. And I'm gonna chat a little bit more about like what it means to be, in the B Corp community. And then from a B Lab perspective, what are some of the things that we're hoping to grow and change and understand? So I want to talk about how justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, letters that you've probably seen, EDI, but that J in there is really, really key, especially in the climate justice, in the climate change conversations, because we're going to talk about how equity and equality aren't quite the same thing. So we're going to spend 20 minutes to chat very quickly about this, but I'm hoping it'll dredge up some really great conversations and questions. So the first thing I want to do is address capitalism, as Christopher has mentioned. And so thinking about like, what is the connection between racism, capitalism, people, and and the structures that are currently set in place. So when you think about what capitalism is, it's really how we run our country. It's how we run our world. It's how we run our business sector. You don't see my screen. Oh yeah, of course. I waited for Christopher to share and then I didn't share. Thank you for telling me. Can we see now? Yay. Okay, great. Thank you guys. I appreciate that. You didn't miss much there on the screen. That was it. And here we are. So we know what capitalism is. It's an economic and political system by which the country trades our industry. We're controlled by profit, right? These are words we've heard before. Everything that we do and say is controlled by profit. And so if we think about profit really pushing forward pretty much all of the aspects of how we think, breathe, and live our lives, then we think about who are the individuals who have the power, i.e. that profit, that money. And if we concentrate this conversation in the US, so I'm going to be very US centric in this conversation, and think about who controls the wealth. By nature, one group, that is the white group of Americans, generally have always held the power because they generally held the money. If we really, really dig back all the way back into history and what history looks like and how the US kind of was built and how businesses were built, we think about the people who created the rules, the regulations, and the processes were the people who had the money. They were not the individuals that we brought over from other countries. They are not the individuals that were poor. Those were not the folks who made the decisions, right? It's not that different now. The more money you make, the bigger you are, the more opportunities you have, the more chances that you have for investments, and so forth and so on. So when we think about this structure was already set up inequitably, simply because everybody didn't have equal power to begin with. So we're going to talk about words that might make you uncomfortable, like white supremacy and racism. And white supremacy, what does that really mean? That does not mean that anybody who is not Black or brown is a bad person, nor does it mean that you've done anything wrong. White supremacy is simply the thinking that there are individuals who set up the way the US was constructed, and that group of individuals looked a certain way and had a lot in common. And so those individuals made the decisions for how we were going to structure our country, and everybody else kind of just fell in line. So white supremacy is the ideology of how the world that we see it was built. Where does business come in, right? People say, like, what does that have to do with business? Well, if a certain group of individuals made the decisions for how a country was run, then certainly they had a lot of power and say in how the economic system was then built. So we can say that this ideology, this way of thinking for this particular group, is depicted as the economic engine of American history, right? These are the decisions and the deciders that helped us kind of build where we are today. Why? Right? That's important to think about. Since capitalism never could end the downturns, we know that there's ups and there's downs, right? When it comes to business. The survival of this economic system in terms of capitalism was only going to work if they could make certain things tolerable, right? So if they can, what we think of as unfair today, there are certain policies and procedures that were set up in equity from the beginning, but that was the purpose. The purpose was to keep certain groups away so that the money could stay with the people who had the money. If you have the money, you have the power. How does that come into play here, right? So we're jamming a lot into 20 minutes. If we think about how we got here, if we think about education laws, who gets into college? Who gets money to go to college? If you think about housing laws, who gets their application looked at? Who gets allowed to live in certain housing properties? Policing, banking, governmental laws, healthcare laws. These are all from Ben and Jerry, a B Corp, by the way, who has really, really great resources on anti-racism and how to embed anti-racist rhetorics into your business. they have a wealth of knowledge on their website. So these are some really good statistics that they've shared in a number of their presentations that kind of help us think about what economic inequality kind of looks like and how we got here. Once we think about how we got here, then we can think about what do we need to do to improve it. So look at some of these statistics here. Black students going to college, Blacks who are in a prison industry, those who are looking for places to live, right? 18%. So me as an African-American woman, if I go to try to find a place to live, regardless of my status, regardless of the money that I make, regardless of where I live, regardless of what I'm bringing to the table, the color of my skin could perhaps mean that I get to look at a lot more houses that are going to be presented only simply because the color of my skin and assumptions that might be made about that. This is today. This is now in 2020. So simply because of the color of my skin, there's certain opportunities folks will not even offer to me simply because of the way that I look. These are real statistics that are actually happening. And so business has the opportunity to change the direction of the economy in the different following ways. And we're going to talk about how. Even healthcare laws, how individuals are actually seen. Walking into a hospital, I would get seen a lot, it would take a lot longer for me to get seen. And these are experiences that I've actually had or seen others have, simply because the rules and regulations that were made long before I ever got here kind of stipulated things to be so. So here we are, and we can determine if you have a structure that is built to uplift a certain group of people, and in this situation, economy was not built for the poor. The economy and capitalism was built for those who had the money so that they continue to have the money, keep the money, and keep the control. If you think about a system that was only built for certain individuals, then it leaves out all those individuals. And it was actually built against the individuals that are outside of that group. That, by definition, is racism. And by definition, white supremacy is the ideology that is the group of people who held the power at the time to make those decisions, right? We can say now that white supremacy is not something that we abide by, we do not support racism, and that we do all these things to stand against oppression of all kinds. But what we also aren't able to do a lot of times is to admit our history and admit why we got here and how we got here. That is really important. I like to point this out because this is the way in which we work. This is the way in which we show up to work every day. Perfectionism is actually a characteristic of the white supremacist culture. The idea that this group of people have made these rules and regulations long before, and this is just the way we show up in business. You have to be perfect. We actually chatted very quickly on the call before we got started today around how you can't make a mistake. Everything's got to be perfect. Everything's got to be so, because those expectations were set. But who decided that business had to be perfect? Who decided that leaders can't make mistakes? Who decided that we cannot at times blunder and fall? And it's created this ideology of perfectionism in business, and that we cannot make a mistake. And our inability to address whenever we've made a mistake sometimes costs us really big business decisions. There's a lot of things here. Defensiveness. You ever be in a work meeting and you just can't tell your colleague that they made a mistake? It's because we have created this structure that you have to be perfect and that you can't tell anybody when they've made a mistake. And it takes away from the human aspect, right? So, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, right? We live in a society where racism exists. Just because it may not be your experience doesn't mean it's not the experience of someone else. I am here to tell you, I experience racism, right? I experienced racism just last week at an Airbnb. It was not a fun experience, but I experienced it, right? And so these are things that are actually happening, and we have to think thoroughly around, is it enough in 2020 just to say, I don't believe in racism? Or do we now have to change the rhetoric and do something about it? What are we going to do about it? And business has a stake in doing so by centering justice in everything that we do. Thinking about the ramifications, thinking about the community in which your businesses are in, thinking about the most marginalized populations of your staff, thinking about the most marginalized populations of your constituents or your students or your customers is how, what can they access? What can they not access? Thinking about that. And if you don't know, because your lived in experience did not shed light on that information, then that is whenever the education, that is whenever you hire folks, that is whenever you bring folks in to lead you, to guide you, and to shed light on your gaps and your and the darkness that you might have simply because you didn't have those experiences. Why is it important to have a people-centered economy? And as Christopher said, not just a money one, not one that only focuses on that dollar. Because if we tie everything to that dollar, we're going to continue to put ourselves in a really tricky situation. We need to put the people first, and not just one type of person, but all kinds of people need to sit equally in the opportunity to have access to information, to money, to funding, and to support. When you think about business, your customers will never love a company if your employees hate it. If your employees hate working, if your employees don't like coming to work and don't like the work that they do because they don't feel respected, heard, understood, there's power and people are money hungry, and they simply cannot do the job that they've been hired to do, you can't expect for the customers to love it because the people that are pouring into your business don't love it as well. So what can you do within your business that is going to elevate some of these marginalized populations, or populations who typically see some sort of disproportionately negative effects? That's what we're talking about. Business is a central human activity. If you're an adult, you've worked, you start contributing to society, you have to do business. You have to shop, you have to feed your family, you have to pay rent, you know, we purchase cars, we go on vacation, we pour into our economy with the money that we earn. We have to make sure that we're putting people first. In order to make sure that people can sufficiently pour back into the economy, we have to pay them a living wage. In order to make sure that our economy continues to grow, we have to educate all levels of society, right? And we have to make sure that we are doing things that are going to put these people first, right? And I think that whenever we have business, we look at our constituents and we look at the majority. That is typically where we've been taught to look at who spends the most, who is going to hit our pockets the hardest. And it is learned to leave everybody else on the background because they're marginal, right? The addition that they bring is so marginal because it's such a small population, it's negligible. We need to shift that thinking, because if you shift it into thinking, if I can understand what's prohibiting these groups from being fully embedded into our work, from working with us, from becoming our customers, from working here and becoming members of our organization, imagine how much more population our customer base would be. Imagine how much more robust our internal efforts will be, because we're coming from conversations that have lots of people with lots of experiences. It is proven that a diverse business is more profitable, lasts longer, and has a larger impact on the society if you have a diverse organization. There's so much background information and knowledge that has to happen in order for us to be able to grow and understand. This is a hard slide to see. For some individuals, the worst thing that can happen to them is other people. For some populations, the worst thing that happens to them is other people. It's not because of a business that has failed them, it's because how other people treat them. So we have to think about, what role does business have in the treatment of human beings? Are we paying them? Are we assisting them? Like, what are you doing for your staff, for individuals that might be experiencing harder times than others, whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to race, whether it's religion, whether it's their background? What are we doing to reach down and really be inclusive to the smallest voices? That's how you know that you're really inclusive. If there's one person in the organization and they only have a representation, or you only have one customer who has a particular religion or is from the LGBTQIA community. And if that person can say that they felt welcomed and included, then you've done your job. But until everybody that you encounter with your business, your staff, your customers, until everyone can say that, there's more work to do. So wrapping up very quickly here, why this is important is because equality and equity are not the same. If you take nothing away from what I'm saying to you and thinking about how justice, how the right thing to do, how to treat people, is equality and equity are not the same. Equality means give everyone the same thing. No matter where you started off, everyone gets the same. We break off even shares and it's fine. But look at this one, right? We've all got somewhere to go, but we all need something different. If I gave everyone the same bike, this isn't helpful. I've done nothing. I probably just left a lot of people who are feeling really left out and unable to do their job. We have to think about what people need to get them to the finish line. And that is why the concept of equality and equity is sometimes very difficult to understand, because it doesn't sometimes seem fair. Why would I only give this person this? You have to think of it as, what can we do to support the most marginalized populations? And if we can give them what they need, then we're going to address the systemic economic equalities across the board. That is how you center justice in everything that you do. And this is why we have to do it, because history continues to repeat itself. Unfortunately, these are not new conversations that some of us are having. And unfortunately, what we've seen with the police brutality, what we've seen with the systemic disproportionate effects of COVID-19 and all of the other things that we've been, climate change that we've been dealing with, disproportionately affects poor people, neurodiverse people, Black people, brown people, indigenous people. History is going to repeat itself, but in such a cunning disguise, that we never detect the resemblance until the damage is already done. But now we have an opportunity to look back and see the damage and figure out what we can do about it. Now we got to transform. What can we do? Commit to educating your leaders and your staff on anti-racist rhetoric, theories, and behaviors. Hire people, pay them, learn. We are currently reading How to Be an Anti-Racist at B-Lab internally. We're reading it as an organization, all of us together. There's resources that are free and that are available. The book was $20. And we got everybody the book and we're reading through this together. It really comes from the intentionality and the want could be there, but now the hard part comes with really reflection and looking internally. Dismantle the aspects of racism embedded in your system and policies. Get help with that. We are hiring folks to come in and look at all of our policies and procedures to determine, are there any disproportionate effects? You know, we're asking surveys of our staff to determine the effects of the choices that we're making. And we're taking everyone's feelings into consideration, even if it's 3% of the internal population. Decentering whiteness in our work and analysis. That just means that there's a current standard that we have. Mix up that standard. It doesn't always have to look the same. The most popular people or the largest population doesn't always have to be the one making the decisions. So mixing up who you're looking at to be your North Star. And center justice in your goals and outcomes and standards. Always be thinking about the most marginalized population, the smallest representation. And lastly, this comes from a persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. There's a lot of internal work that has to happen whenever we're addressing Jedi. And it's okay to get it wrong. It's okay to make mistakes. Find your group and learn together. And to be an anti-racist is a radical choice. It's difficult to have these conversations. It's tough to talk about them. I'm dismissing my timer. But it's radical and it's hard. But in the face of history, we've seen what has happened and we just have to do something different. So be brave, be scared, but do it anyway. And you're in good company. B Corps, if you're working with the B Corp, or we have a lot of consultant firms and companies that are all B Corps. And we have a whole directory that you can go in and look by field of the different B Corps that might be available or be of service to you within your organization. And I'm always available for quick chats internally if you need any support with your anti-racism or Jedi journey. So thanks for the invite. It's been great.
So much. Thank you both so much. If you can stay around a few
Yep.
more minutes, we've got some questions that some of them have been answered, but even some of the questions that have been answered, I'm going to pose
Right.
again, if that's okay, so that everybody
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah, so-
definitely. I went ahead and some of the ones I knew the answer to, I would sort of type something in so people would get some, but yeah, I think definitely maybe some of them could be talked about.
So one is there an in investing, if people want to invest in B Corps, is there an easy place to get a list? You know, Chris, I think you've answered that at bcorporation.net, and you have a search tool there.
Yeah, that's a helpful thing. This Global Impact Investing Network is also a useful site I've found for stuff on impact investing. Yeah, I should have, you know, we should have put the B Corp logo on some of our slides. Some people asked about, you know, what it looks like. So also on that bcorporation.net, people can get a sense of the logo, which is on products as well.
Great, thank you. Another question is, Danone is a major source of single-use plastics. I guess both of you might want to address this. Does
Right.
their B Corp status affect that, or is that taken into consideration? Who wants to go first on that one?
I don't know, Ellonda, I always feel
Yeah,
bad. I mean, you're the one who works at B Lab, so it's like,
Oh,
I have
please.
some thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, oddly enough, you probably know more but than I do about like that particular process. So it's taken into consideration, right? In order, whenever you go in and take the basic impact assessment, you get a number of points for every question that you basically answer. So it's taken into consideration by its simple nature of the fact that the questions are asked. And also you take into consideration, are any of these things recyclable? Can any of the, you know, so it's taken into consideration. I wouldn't say that it affects them in terms of their status because they still have earned enough points or done some other things in other areas that really elevate that. So Christopher, you might have more.
Yeah, no, very similar. You know, I mean, it's a comprehensive evaluation, and so, you know, it's my guess is I wish that I had a really good answer for you, and I knew what Danone was doing. Just from knowing them, my bet is that they're actually doing progressive things around, you know, recycling and, you know, use in experimental materials. You know, other B Corps that I've talked to that are really involved with this, like Seventh Generation, for instance. I recently interviewed the CEO of Seventh Generation about their environmental commitment. And it's sort of amazing, you know, the amount of work that they put into actually trying to reduce plastic, and they take responsibility for plastic through end of life. So you know, many people, they say they're sort of plastic neutral, but that's just, you know, taking care of the plastic that goes out of their building. I mean, to take actually responsibility for it, for its whole life, and ways of, you know, creating new technologies to have the cap be recyclable on, you know, on bottles, which is actually very hard to do, I guess, technically, to have the cap be recycled, to, you know, actually shrinking the amount of water in products, having more concentrated in products or solid products that could be wrapped in paper. So my sense is, just because I know, you know, that's things that Seventh Generation is doing, but having a lot of experience talking to people at Danone, my guess is they're doing some of those things too, but maybe not as much.
Thank you. We have a question about investing. Todd would like to know, as elders with existing portfolios, we hope to steer well and leave better for our families. What would you say are the top few questions and answers should we be asking our investment advisor about current and changing B Corp participation in our portfolios? And he wants to know, should we include both positive questions, what is the proportion of, et cetera, or as well as negative? I don't know if you have some perspective on that in terms of asking questions of financial advisors.
So, my feeling is, I mean, everyone has different interests, as far as, maybe some people are more focused on the environment, maybe some people are more focused on, you know, staying away from industries like, tobacco or oil or whatever. So I think the one thing is, sort of what your own personal values are and where you want to invest. If you want to invest on the environment, you can certainly, there's all kinds of information that can be found that the investment managers have that's available through the Bloomberg terminal or wherever on their ESG metrics, there's environmental, social and governance metrics, and publicly traded companies, many of them report on those nowadays. So, the investment manager can sort of look and see what best of class companies are, in certain industries along the ESG. The big investor, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest investors in the country, has been really focused on this and writing letters saying the company should be much more focused on their environmental footprint and report on that. So I think that's something that's been happening.
All right, thank you. There's another question. I think it's been answered, but it might be helpful to kind of hear that answer. And that is, how has the pandemic affected corporations' ability to stay true to their JEDI focus?
Yeah, I answered it, but I didn't answer it correctly. I was answering another question, so I'm glad you asked. I'm typing in the right answer now. But what I did is I popped in the information for Danone, because on our website, you can see how Danone,
great.
Yeah, like what their grade is, their overall impact assessment, and then you can actually go into their individual impact area scores, and you can see how they scored on like environmental or community. So for anyone who is interested, and you actually can do that for any B Corp anywhere. Cool. So very quickly to answer that particular question, it's been actually really cool to see how B Corps have approached this. Most of them have actually bolstered their JEDI work. They've actually reallocated more funds to justice, to equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially as it relates to like the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 and things that were happening for individuals within their constituencies. So they've switched to PPE models. We ourselves have been shifting, not a lot, I won't say a lot, but we have shifted some of our fundraising efforts to actually building in JEDI infrastructure into the request for funding, so that if we get money, we actually will have funds to train, to have sessions, to do educational opportunities, and learn more in-depth conversations around what it means to embed JEDI and justice into the work that we do. So a lot of B Corps have shifted, but that is not to say that a number of B Corps have had other fallouts and maybe put pause on some of their JEDI efforts to come back to. And what we've done is we're trying to meet that demand within our B Corps as it relates to whether it's their fees, whether it's to give them more opportunities to make payments over time with those fees and structuring those differently. We've created other opportunities and discounts for small businesses, for women-owned businesses, businesses that are minority-owned, to either continue to get them in. So we've kind of bolstered our JEDI work, but it's been really cool to see how a lot of B Corps have shifted focus to actually make sure that they are educating internally or specifically putting forth that JEDI work, so that they don't find themselves making some sort of JEDI egregious or mistake in this really tough time that we're dealing with now.
Thank you. That's really encouraging to hear. It's not often that you get encouraging news about corporations' response, and we've seen a lot of responses by corporations with very large sums of money and contributing very tiny pennies on the dollar to make themselves appear to be supportive and on board, and it's very frustrating to see that. I think this is probably a question for you, Chris. How do companies like Ben & Jerry's and Danone think about their basic product, which is dairy, which, because it's a result of cows, and they are a big greenhouse gas emitter, there's probably other companies too whose products involve a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, yet they're still committed to the B Corp principles. Could a fossil fuel or beef company become a B Corp?
So My guess is that a fossil fuel company probably could not. Beef, I'm not as certain about. I do think, and this is something that we sometimes forget about in sort of assessing companies. There's a difference, I think, between like an intrinsic and a compensatory good. Many companies do CSR to compensate for the negative things they're doing, but I think the companies you need to think about what the sort of intrinsic business model is. And I think your question gets right to that. I know that Danone, for instance, some of the products I mentioned, Silk, soy milk, So Delicious, they've actually been, with their acquisitions, been moving away from dairy to sort of plant-based, plant-based alternatives, which I think, is one way that they're thinking about it. But I do think, your intuition to be thinking about the core business of the company is right on, because, and this is one of the things I think, the B Corp model does take that somewhat into account, whereas other maybe sort of CSR type of evaluations don't.
Great, thank you. We do have one person who's asking if you might be willing to share your email addresses. And if not, that's perfectly fine. We're actually out of time. I'd like to thank you both. This has been an incredibly informative and enlightening presentation by both of you. And I know we've gotten comments that, this is a great job both of you had done, and we really appreciate your time with us. And we are certainly internally and in everything that we do committed to equity and justice, and have been, and maybe not as formalized as we are now, but we certainly are. As we're leaving, Jen has a slide she'd like to share with you all. If you have a favorite B Corp that now you know a little bit more about B Corps and who they are, if you put it in the chat, we're going to have a list of our favorite B Corps in our next newsletter from our members. And don't all write Ben and Jerry's, because we'll have that a lot, I'm sure, particularly this time of day when people are going to look for a little bit of dessert. And also, our next call is in October, and I invite you to join us. That call will be on October 27th, same time, same place. Here's another slide of our website that's been, where you can go to take action, and I hope you will do that. I also hope that if you possibly can, we thrive only on donations, and if anybody, if you can possibly provide us with some small donations, that enables us to continue to support the programs that we can offer. And we're committed to stemming climate change and doing so in a just and equitable way. And we're very much on board with B Corps, and we hope to learn more about it and engage more with B Corps. I'm sure that many of you have many favorites on the list. So thank you all, and good night. We'll see you next month.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.